Welcome everybody to another episode of the Statesman Podcast. Your host Nelson Machka. In this podcast, today we unpack two pivotal moments in Southern African diplomacy. Cyril Ramaphosa's recent trip to the White House to counter white genocide claims and secure trade ties, and Robert Mugabe's defiant response to a 1997 UK letter that disavowed land reform commitments. One chose engagement, that is Cyril Ramaphosa, and the other confrontation, and you know who it is, Robert Gabriel Mugabe, leading to violent fast-track land reform, agricultural collapse, and economic disaster. What happens when leaders face international pressure, engage or confront? Today we compare two African leaders who took very different paths with very different outcomes. Now we need to understanding the events leading to the chosen path by each of the two leaders. But it's also important to note that you cannot separate Cyril Ramaphosa from ANC, and you cannot separate Robert Mugabe's actions and generally how ZANU-PF approach. But it should be stated that normally the man at the top, the president, he has a lot of sway in which direction to take. So the first event, I'm going to focus on the South African case briefly, and then I'll go to the Zimbabwean case. And note, in the Zimbabwean case, the issue is not about land reform, please, but it's about the diplomatic side of things. So, in the South African case, it's a case of land, genocide, and trade. I would like to describe it that way. So, the South African government was facing accusations of committing genocide against white South Africans. Accusations which came mainly from far-right circles. These are ideologies or groups that occupy the most reactionary end of the spectrum. The leading group in this case was AfriForum, which is a South African non-government organization which focuses on interests of Afrikaners. Americans seemed to have believed the narrative, or it helped, at least in their cause, to believe it than to believe the truth. For me, it's a case of post-politics or strategic ignorance, post-truth politics or strategic ignorance. So what you call post-truth politics in political science is a conscious decision to avoid the truth because the truth might be inconvenient. That's exactly, for me, what Washington did or is doing. Now, objective facts in this case are less influential to shape public opinion and emotions. Objective of the diplomatic trip by Cyril was to correct misinformation, strengthen trade, and diplomatic ties. So, what was at stake? What might have influenced engagement from the part of Cyril Ramaphosa than confrontation? The first thing is trade. In 2024, the total trade in goods between the US and South Africa was approximately $20.5 billion US dollars. US imports from South Africa amounted to 14.7 billion of the 20.5 billion, and while US exports into South Africa or to South Africa were 5.8 billion. Key export sectors under AGOA, according to 2022 data, I couldn't get recent data. You have your automotives, cars and their parts, precious stones and metals, ferroalloys, you have got jewelry, you have got citrus, you have got wine, which all fall under AGOA. And then you have got job creation, which was at stake and which is still at stake. And our estimations suggest that AGOA is supported over 500,000 jobs directly and indirectly. Now, for context, to my fellow Zimbabweans, I want to value or to put into context how much is 500,000 jobs. So according to the last census in Zimbabwe, Mutare is 224,802 people. Masvingo, now this is a population, overall population of young people, adults and older people. Masvingo is 90,286. Gweru is 161,294. These three cities, the overall population of people staying in those urban centers is 476,382, which means if AGOA, in this case, exactly the way it is beneficial in South Africa, if we are going to put it in Zimbabwe, Masvingo, Mutare, and Gweru, everyone in there would be employed. Everyone. That's how important AGOA is to South Africa. Now, what was the outcome of this trip? At the time, it seemed SA had managed to contain SA-US relations. Those seems to be a developing issue. May have avoided sanctions or economic fallout. We will see what happens. But I think it also preserved investor confidence, even if domestic issues persist. AGOA, which it is likely going to be extended, maybe dependent maybe on developments going forward. We will see. And then I want us to shift to event number 2, which is more important. Right, the case of Robert Mugabe, the land issue, and then I am going to briefly also speak about the Commonwealth saga. So the arrangement concerning compensation for white farmers in Zimbabwe, as far as land reform was concerned, at the 1979 Lancaster House Conference, was a compromise based on the principle of willing buyer, willing seller, with the British government agreeing to provide financial assistance for land redistribution. So what happened was this. In 1997, a letter came from Clara Short. She was the then British Secretary of State for International Development. Now, it was directed to Kumbira Kangai, who was the Minister of Land, Agriculture, and so forth from the Zimbabwean government. Now, this significantly impacted the already tense situation surrounding land reform. Here is how the Zimbabwean government responded and the context surrounding the response. Now, key points to note from Claire Short's letter were that number 1, Short stated that the new Labour government in Britain did not accept that it had a special responsibility to fund land purchases in Zimbabwe. Then secondly, she emphasized that the new government had no links to former colonial interests. Number 3, while acknowledging the need for land reform, she stressed that any British support would be contingent on a transparent and fair program that contributed to poverty reduction. Poverty reduction was very key in their approach in what they were proposing. But to be fair, in my own opinion, I also feel what the British government did was hugely unfair. A state cannot renege on its promises done by the previous government. A state is not a government. A government represents the state. That really was not fair to Zimbabwe from the part of the United Kingdom. Okay, this is something that we can always talk on in its own part. Like I said, today it's not about land reform, it's about foreign policy. Let's move on. So Zimbabwe's government's response, confrontation instead of diplomacy. That's how they responded. They confronted the United Kingdom. They did not implement strategic diplomacy that could have served the best interest of Zimbabwe. As the results came to vindicate, or from inside, we can say it was one of the worst decisions that they ever did, or one of the worst diplomatic strategies that they implemented confronting the United Kingdom, thereby confronting the West as a whole. So the Zimbabwean government led by Robert Mugabe, they viewed Clary Shorty's letter as a betrayal of what they believed was a commitment made at the 1979 Lancaster House Conference. They interpreted it as Britain reneging on its historical obligation to help rectify the land imbalances created during the colonial era. Now, the letter fueled resentment and anger within the Zimbabwe government, contributing to a hardening of their stance on land reform. This contributed to the increase in the rhetoric that the land reform that was to take place was to correct colonial injustices. The letter is seen even today by some analysts as the catalyst that helped lead to the fast-track land reform program, which involved often violent and chaotic land seizures. So the Zimbabwean government used the letter to reinforce their narrative that the West was against the interests of Zimbabwe. What was the context and what were the consequences of the Zimbabwe's response? So the letter arrived, this is the context, the letter arrived at a time when tensions over land distribution were already high in Zimbabwe. The willing buyer, willing seller model had yielded slow progress, and there was growing pressure for more radical land reform. The Zimbabwean government used the letter to justify its subsequent land policies which they carried from that point going forward, arguing that it had been forced to act due to Britain's withdrawal of support. Now, the fallout from the letter further strained relations between Zimbabwe and Britain and contributed to Zimbabwe's increasing international isolation. The letter is a key point of contention in the historical narrative of the Zimbabwean land reform programs. So, how did the judiciary responded to the fast-track land reform which was being implemented by Zimbabwe? So, the Chief Justice back then was called Anton Gubey. He was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court from 1990 to 2001. He led several rulings declaring that land seizures without due process violated property rights protected under the Constitution. Now, he also ruled that the state failed to provide adequate legal justification for the invasions. Then these invasions were led by war veterans and ZANU-PF supporters. Now, the result is that in 2001, Gubey was forced into early retirement after intense pressure from the government. The Justice Minister back then was Patrick Chinamasa. He openly threatened the judiciary, saying judges who defied the government would be removed. Gubey was replaced by Godfrey Chikausiku, who defied earlier rulings by Gubey. Then there's also a curious case of Justice Fergus Blakey. He was a High Court judge. In 2002, he convicted the Minister of Justice, Patrick Chinamasa, of contempt of court. Shortly afterward, Blakey was arrested and charged with corruption over a minor administrative issue. Now, here is the bigger picture which I feel was supposed to have guided the diplomatic response from Zimbabwe. 1. Agriculture was the biggest contributor to the economy. Contribution to GDP ranging between 9% and 18% during the period before 2000. Some sources even state that it reached around 15% on average. Number 3, employment. The sector was the largest employer, providing livelihoods to between 60 and 70% of the Zimbabwean population. Just for context sake, in 1998, unemployment rate in Zimbabwe was just 6.4%, and right now we are talking of something over 90% according to some states. But whichever case may be, undoubtedly it's over 85% and above, which is way too high. So in terms of export earnings, agriculture was a major source of foreign currency, contributing between 20 and 40% of Zimbabwe's total export earnings. Today, in terms of our sources of foreign currency, it has been surpassed by mining by far and by remittances. So you can imagine how low agriculture really has collapsed. And then we also have an issue of raw materials for industry. Agriculture supplied about over 60% of the raw materials needed by Zimbabwe's agro-processing manufacturing industries, highlighting its crucial link to the other sectors of the economy. And then in terms of food security, before 2000, Zimbabwe was often referred to as the breadbasket of Africa. Now, this was due to its capacity to produce enough food to feed its population and even export surplus, particularly maize. And then the other important aspect is Zimbabwe-West trade and diplomatic relationship. It was worth protection. Just the same way we see the South African and American diplomatic relationship is very much beneficial to South Africa. It's worth protecting and fighting for. So information from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Trade in Zimbabwe shows us that loan inflows to Zimbabwean companies from EU countries back then increased from 134 million to, and that was in 1980, 134 million in 1980 to 480 million in the 1990s. Now, this signified increased trade. Between the year 2000 and 2008, after the fallout with the British, the inflows fell significantly to an average of 80 million per year. So as far as trade with the United States is concerned, this is how bad things have been for Zimbabwe, I'm telling you. As far as trade with the United States is concerned, because when you speak of the West, you are speaking of Europe, Western Europe, and the United States. In diplomatic circles, that's what is called the West. So when you speak of the West, it's not only Western Europe, but it also encompasses the United States because of their relationship. Whatever the European Union does, America is also in it. If America sanctions you, you should know that the European Union also is in it. So combined, they are called the West in diplomatic circles. So as far as trade with the United States is concerned, we know how important AGOA is to South Africa and to many other African countries which are a part of this. 3 countries, nevertheless, have never been eligible for the African Growth and Opportunities Act, AGOA, since its formulation in 2000. And these countries are Somalia, Sudan, and you know which one is the third one? Zimbabwe. That's how bad the situation or the relationship between Zimbabwe and the West has been. We are being ranked alongside Somalia and Sudan. That should tell you, and these are countries which have a lot of issues, a lot of domestic instability, civil wars, and so forth. And that's where we are ranked when it comes to our access to the AGOA opportunity. So this is an indictment on how uninterested our government is in being part of the global community and doing the right things. At least it's consolation, though. I need to state that, the Second Republic seems to be making some moves to join the international community. I don't know how earnest they are, because the demands from the West on how we're supposed to govern ourselves as Zimbabwe definitely is a threat to ZANU-PF holding onto power. So I want to draw a pattern, otherwise only to use the clear short letter and what happened and the diplomatic fallout that happened then might not be sufficient enough and might not be fair on the part of Zimbabwe for me to say, okay, Zimbabwe is more confrontational in its foreign policy than it needed to be. So that's not only the case. So in early 2000s as well, Zimbabwe faced increasing international criticism over human rights abuses, suppression of political opposition, media repression, electoral irregularities around the 2000 parliamentary and 2002 presidential elections. In March 2003, the suspension was extended indefinitely, actually. So in 2002, the Commonwealth suspended Zimbabwe for 12 months. And in March 2003, the suspension was extended indefinitely after a review by the Troika of the Commonwealth. And this Troika, it was composed of Australia, Nigeria, and our neighbors, South Africa. In December 2003, Robert Mugabe withdrew Zimbabwe from the Commonwealth, stating this is it. It's quits and it's irreversible. So this can be seen as a strategy to reject multilateral scrutiny, framing it as a neo-colonialism led by Britain and the West. But it is my opinion that Zimbabwe's foreign policy is bonkers. It has been bonkers, really, and it led to isolation of Zimbabwe at the international scale. We had to come up with what we coined the Look East policy because we had removed ourselves from the rest of the progressive Western world. I'm not saying China, the East, is not progressive. It's an argument for another day. So we had to look West to replace, we had to look East to replace the West. So the lesson is clear. When dealing with powerful nations and institutions, especially from a position of relative weakness, it pays more to play chess than to flip the board. Who flipped the board? ZANU-PF and Robert Mugabe. They flipped the board. So especially when you are in a position of relative weaknesses, you don't flip the board, you play the chess. South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa didn't abandon the principles of diplomacy, but they understood that staying at the table is very powerful. There is power in staying at the table. It's important that you don't leave the table. Zimbabwe, on the other hand, walked away and has been trying to find its way back ever since. Are we going to be incorporated back? Time shall tell. Let's hope for the best. Thank you so much for watching this episode. If you find value in these conversations, please don't forget to subscribe and share to your networks. If you have any comments, the inbox, the comment section is very open. I'm going there right now, so I'll be waiting for your comments and for any discussive points, and then we can always take it forward from there. Thank you so much. See you next time.